Okay, this is the 14th of June, 1987. This is another in a series of interviews by Erik Brynildson, relevant to research at the Fountain Lake Farm, the old John Muir boyhood home site. With me this afternoon are Bev Schmitz and his wife Beverly, and Owen Owens and his wife Polly. And what we're going to do is just have an open discussion on what Irv and Owen primarily remember about the site when they were younger. And I think Irv's wife Beverly also has some recollections. So we're going to start, I think, this afternoon by going outside into the farmyard site and trying to recall just where the depression was. Okay, we're now standing out here at the Fountain Lake Farm, and we're looking out over John Muir's carex meadow. And I'm going to turn it over now to Owen Owens, and he's going to recollect a little bit about how the meadow has changed over the years.
Well, back in the late 20s and early 30s, when you were out on the lake and looked over this way, it was pasture land. There was a small bunch of willows and tag alders along the shore with the marsh grass, and then the work into the meadow up onto the side of the hill. Then up on the side of the hill was a depression and some rock, and in that area was where I was told that the original John Muir cabins and house was built.
Owen, what do you remember specifically about the cellar depression? Now, Irv is with us too here today, and you've heard the tape that we played before we came out here, the interview I had with Irv in January this year, and he's convinced, and I am too, that the present-day house, the house that Archie, his father, built in the 1940s, is indeed on the old cellar depression. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, as near as I can tell from looking here, I'd have to agree with that entirely. It looks like to me it's in the approximate position that I would guess that the old depression used to be. And in the absence of finding the old depression, we have to assume, I guess, that the building was built on it, and that's covered it up. Mm-hmm. And because this is the area in which the people who lived here when Muir was here said that his original cabin was built.
Mm-hmm. Owen, standing where we are now, right here at the foot of the slope that the house sits up there on the hill, and looking up there, I know inside before we were on tape, you mentioned that your recollection was that the cellar depression might have been just a little to the left amongst the trees up there. Standing here now, does it seem to you like the house is about where you recall it being?
The tree growth here has changed so much that it would be somewhat of a guess, but it is in the approximate position that I would assume it was going to be. It was on the side hill on that general slope that bears that way. And consequently, I would have to say that the best evidence we'd have, I guess, is that's where it was.
So you don't remember for sure, though. We can rule out the site between the lilacs was never the site that the depression was at.
To the best of my knowledge, that is correct.
Okay.
My dad moved out of here, 46, right around 49 or 50. That they moved back to the home place, and then he sold this place here, and now is the first I've been back in here, and boy, oh boy, I hardly know the place.
And
really something.
And Owen, the last time you were on the site was when?
The last time I was not actually on the site was on the lake, and that was in the early 40s.
We should add that Owen is the son of David Owens, who is featured in a photograph that's dated 1920 in the iconographic archives at the State Historical Society, and it shows his father, David, probing with a stick in the old cellar depression. Okay, we're now up at the house site again, and we're going to be walking over and looking at the depression that's situated between the two large lilacs here. But in walking up the slope, both men agreed that it makes sense that the Muir house would have sat up on top of the knoll or the hill rather than into the slope. Okay, we're now over at the lilac site, and Irv, on the way over here, was commenting on how large the pair of lilacs has got. Do you want to tell me about how small they were at your earliest recollections, Irv?
Well, near as I can recollect, when we built the house up here, they could have been more than 4 or 5 feet across. There was just one bush. And now, man, they're as big as a house.
And Owen, what do you remember about this depression? Does anything at all?
I don't remember this. It looks to me like rather than a depression, this has probably been a wash.
Back years ago when we pastured this was an open wash down through here. You can see where the wash is over there, and then down here it was all open. The water come down way from up on the hill up here and went across the road, and then it gouged it out here. But it's all sodded over through the years, and it wasn't pastured anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, and I'm wondering. Certainly, the washout could have started from the lane coming in, and also. It makes sense that with the 2 lilacs flanking this depression area, that the bur oak shanty would have sat in here, and possibly that digging out would have started the washout too. It seems to me that when I've lined up the Muir sketches and so on with the meadow, that the shanty would have sat into the hill right here, into the slope. Okay, now Irv is recalling what the landscape looked like around here when he was on the farm.
Well, yeah, north of the house here, this was all wide open, clear out to the road out there, and we used to plow all that and plant corn and grain and hay and all the rest of the stuff, and now it's all grew up. I don't know.
Okay. Owen, do you see any place at all up here in the farmyard now where the depression may have been, if it wasn't where the house is? Is there anything that might look like it?
I don't see anything. The house, I think, probably covers what I recall as the depression, because I don't see anything other than that.
Owen, did your father speak to you much about the Muirs or about the Muir farm? Did you ever hear any stories about it as to what happened to the buildings, or any stories about the Muirs?
He used to talk some about the Muirs. I don't recall anything particular about what happened to the buildings. It was my understanding that they either burned or were burned sometime after he left this area.
What year do you think that might have been, Owen, when the buildings burned?
I couldn't give you any idea that it would be anywhere near accurate.
Okay.
But I think it was probably along about in the 70s or 80s, 1870s or 80s.
Did he ever talk about the Galloways that bought the farm from Dan Muir? Sarah Muir married David Galloway.
No, I have no recollections of any great information about the Galloways.
Tell me a little bit about your own home farm. I'd like to hear something about the history of the old David Gray farm.
Well, as I understand it, the David Grays came in there and built a house which was one of the first frame houses in Wisconsin, sometime in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and that they lived there for a period of time, and I don't know just when they left. I believe that's recorded in David Gray's book.
You also your wife Polly was recollecting a nice photo that featured the house with.
Yeah, we had seen a photo that shows the house, a white upright, the upright portion only, painted white, and there was a path with roses and flowers which led toward to the river. Now, at that time, the river was still active as a method of transportation, and the landing that was on that farm was the only hard landing for a good many miles either way, and consequently it was a place at which most of them took on timber, which was the fuel for the boats at the time.
Okay.
And
what do you remember about the Gray house? It was actually white, and it was quite a nice house. It's probably the earliest frame house in Marquette County.
I would think, as far as that I was told, it was the earliest in the region, yes.
Okay. I'm going to stop it. Okay, now we're going to move on to, I'm pretty interested in what the view down to the spring meadow and beyond to the lake was when the Muirs were on the farm. And to do that, we're going to have Owen and Irv comment on the line now, or the wall of vegetation, especially silver maple, that blocks the view out to the lake. Do you want to start, Irv, on that?
Well, now, the way it is, you can't even see the lake or anything else. Back years ago, you could look clear across the lake to the Ruby Shaw's land, way over across, and now you can't see nothing over there.
What about, you said the big spring that bubbled up down there in the meadow started drying up in the 1930s, was it?
The big spring down on the meadow down there used to boil up out of the ground, and then it come to dry years. Why, it just kind of settled back. It still runs, but not like it did then. We used to have a lot of water running out that creek going out down there, remember? How that used to be.
Is there more trees growing up in the meadow? Was the meadow itself more open years ago?
Well, to a certain extent around the outside, it wasn't quite so brushy, but not too much difference down there. It's more the trees that have grew up around it. The meadow itself is so soft that nothing will grow there.
Okay. Now we're going to have Owen comment on the same thing.
As I recall, when you were sitting in the lake in a boat looking up this way, the main thing you could see was some tags and some alders and some willows along the shore and out into a marsh. Now this marsh here is basically all marl marsh, and it is extremely soft and spongy, and so that the trees did not grow until they reached somewhat of the peat area, and then as you came up the hill and towards where the depression was and across to the highway, that was all open land, largely pastured, at times had been cultivated.
Owen, do you remember your dad ever telling you that he remembered any of the Muir buildings existing, or did he know anybody that knew about them, or any old boards or fencing left from the Muirs?
Apparently, when he came into this area in 1890, the buildings were gone, and I don't recall him giving any exact dates and when if anyone had told him when they had disappeared.
Okay. Did you want to add anything, Irv?
No, only that the only thing I'd like to add is when we used to pasture this land here, and that the cattle used to get mired down in the meadow down here, and then we'd have to put a hay fork rope on them and hook a team of horses on and then pull them out of the mud. And one heifer we lost, and we didn't know where she went till her bones come to the top later on. She sunk in the mud and then her bones floated up. So there's no bottom down here at all, and it's best to stay out of it.
Okay, also joining us today is Bessie Eggleston, and I'm going to be asking her some questions. Before I do, though, I want Irv's wife, Bev, to comment on some of her recollections, too, of the site.
Well, I don't know. There isn't too much more I can add, only that when we used to sit here and look out, you could see right down to the lake and across. That's just really grew up back here.
Has the house itself changed much since Archie lived here?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay. Were you telling me the last time you visited that Irv's mother had an interest in wild colors or something in the house?
Oh, she liked colors, no question about that, yeah.
Did she like pink and stuff like that?
Pink, bright greens, yeah, orange, yeah.
Okay. Owen, the lane that comes back into the house that you came in on today, where you could see the logging going on, is the lane in the same place that it's always been, as long as you can remember?
I don't even remember that there was really a lane there in the days that I was around here. That was all open land, and just a kind of a road there. We drove around wherever you wanted to. There was nothing to obstruct you.
There was no trees, no nothing. There wasn't anything.
Just that big hickory tree that sat down
The only thing that was along there was down in a hollow. When you first come in here, there was a great big hickory tree. Otherwise, there was nothing. No brush, no nothing.
Is that hickory tree that you're talking about, Irv, still standing?
I don't know. I never looked when I come in today. I was looking off this other way where they were cutting them pines off. So.
Where would that have stood when you're driving in the driveway? Would it be to your right then, off on the parkland?
It was on the right-hand side, just as you go down through the hollow down there, the first hollow. It was on the right-hand side, and a huge hickory tree, but I never looked to see what it was there today or not. I don't think so. Not as big as that sucker big around in them days.
How far off of the driveway would it have been if one would go out and look for a stump even or something?
Oh, it wouldn't be more than 10, 20 feet. Not any more than that.
Owen, have you been out on the lake itself and looked up here since Archie Schmitz has had the house here back in the 40s?
I have not.
Okay, I was wondering if back then you could see this house sitting up here from the water.
I am sure that you could, because there was no problem with that, because the last time I was here just before Archie built the house, I was on the lake with my father, and there was no problem in seeing the things up here.
We go out on the lake fishing. We could watch up here. Grandma'd go with us, and she'd say, "Well, I got company. We got to go to shore." So you could see it when people would drive in up here.
Okay, well, you certainly couldn't today.
It's a shame the way it grew up, but then Mother Nature covers up everything. But it's too bad you can't look out across the lake like we used to years ago.
Well, we're going to do something about that, or if those trees are going to be cut yet this summer. Okay, now I'm going to have Bessie Eggleston, too, recollect what she recalls about the site here. Go ahead, Bessie.
The trees have grown up so it's almost unrecognizable in this area. The lilacs have spread, and I don't know whether we could even find the stones that were the foundation of the house. It was quite open way back years ago. I remember we used to have a field trip to the site of the buildings when I was teaching in this area, and for several different years after I taught in the Montello schools. But just even the last 10 years, it has grown up terrifically.
Bessie, what years would you have been teaching and brought the class out on the field trips? And then beyond that, was Archie Schmitz then living here in the house when you came here?
No, he was not. The first years that I brought children here was back in about 1935 and 36. Then after that, it was in the 1960s and 70s that I brought children here.
So in the 30s, then, no house would have been sitting up here. It would have been the cellar depression, right?
There was nothing here during the 30s. This was all barren, with just the cornerstones of the basement.
Tell me more about the depression. What do you remember before Archie built here about the depression?
Well, the depression, you mean the financial depressions?
No.
Or the depression of the cellar depression? It was filled in just from being washed in and wind and so forth. The basement wasn't really visible at all to speak of. There was just a slight depression where the basement stood. But this is not where the Muir house stood, where this house is. The Muir house stood back where the stone wall, part of the stone wall, stands. And that is pretty much filled in, except a few stones you can see the corners of the building and so forth, but otherwise there's nothing much there.
Now, the stones that you're speaking of, Bessie, are in this gully over here just off of the lane. And
by the lilacs. Yes, by the lilacs.
Okay, which side of the lilacs as we're here? Is it on the far side of the lilacs? You mean all those stones, the field stones?
The stones are between that two groups of lilacs.
Okay, so it's that depression there's a lilac on each side of it then. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, today, you really can't see much there at all. It looks like we were commenting on it just a little while ago. Owen and Irv thought it looked like a washout.
No, that's, my dad remembered that well, and he said that was the cornerstones that formed the basement, and if you dig there, I think you'll find that they are cornerstones. Some of them are rolled down, but...
See, now, in my research, it looks to me like, I agree with you, there's certainly cornerstones there, and they're lined up. I've been out and measured them. They're definitely lined up. But the size of those would tell me that, and the way they're located, and based on John Muir's sketches, everything looks like that's where the Bur Oak shanty sat. That would have been the initial log shanty, garret-style structure that the Muirs put up. It only took them a couple days to erect that, and it was a temporary shelter that was later converted to a horse shanty. And actually, the substantial frame farmhouse was situated where this house is today.
Well, I wouldn't want to argue on that.
Okay. What else do you recall about the site, Bessie, as far as the landscape goes?
Well, the pond and the spring have completely disappeared the last time that I was in that area around the spring hole. There was a trickle of water where they used to get their water from, but not a large flow of water. It's all filled in.
Do you remember these big silver maples that are in the yard here as shade trees? When you brought your field trips out here, your classes out here, these maples certainly were huge in especially the 60s and 70s. That's not too long ago.
They were here at that time.
And of course the house would have been here too in the 60s and 70s. Yes. It belonged to
the last years that I brought the children here, this house was built here.
Are they still doing field trips like that, Bessie, to the site?
Yes, but I don't think they go out in nature. They're usually to museums or zoos or a circus or some such thing, but...
This would be the Montello School?
Yes.
You must recall when Archie Schmitz built the little house up here. It took some years, Irv has told me, to put the house up. They did it rather slowly and all of it by hand. What do you recall about those years in the 40s when Archie was building here?
I wasn't living here during the 40s.
Okay. Now, I've also interviewed Ben Hull and Harry Kearns at great length, and those two guys, both of them were early assessors in Buffalo Township. They both recall, they heard rumors, in fact, while Archie was building the house up here, that indeed he did build it on the old cellar depression, and that was their recollection, too. They were convinced that the old Muir cellar depression was dug out by Archie and then he built on it.
I don't know.
It's okay. Okay, we also just learned that... Okay, I'm going to have Bessie tell us who built the house here for Archie Schmitz, at least who did the carpentry work, because they are some relatives of hers.
Elmer and Bert Eggleston built the house. Elmer was my husband's father, and Bert was his uncle.
Thank you. Now I'm going to have Bessie comment on the house that sat over by the granite marker in Muir Park, the house that had the two wings on it that was featured in Trail of the Serpent. Do you want to comment on that, Bessie?
I don't know what you were saying.
Oh, what we're talking about is the house that you and Owen were discussing over in the park. You want to tell me what you remember about that one?
Well, I remember the fancy fluting on the roof that I always thought it looked like icicles hanging down. And it was more or less a square house, 2-story, had pine floors and stove in the living room, and the chimney hole up through the floor to the upstairs part, which had a board over it, and when you wanted to walk through the room, you better watch so you didn't stub your toe on that board during the summertime, because it covered the hole where the chimney went through. And My dad was born there, and his one sister and four brothers.
Your father would have been Sam McGuinn. Now his father would have been Howard McGuinn, or as they refer to him, Old Howard McGuinn. Is that who? That's not true? Okay, that's a brother then. What I'm trying to get at this time is who built that house that sat over in the park. I heard it was a McGuinn.
I don't know who built the house. It was built there before the McGuinn lived there. I believe it was a man by the name of Johnny Otto that built the house in the beginning. And then the McGuinns came in there a few years later.
What do you remember about the house, Bessie, as far as, was it ever painted?
Yes, it was painted. It had, at one time, I think, yellow colored paint on it, but it was mostly washed off so that it didn't show up except under the eaves and so forth.
So, do you remember, in fact, what color the shingles are? Think details like that?
The shingles were wooden shingles.
Okay, and did it have a wing on each side of the upright?
No.
So, in other words, it was just a square house with no wings on it at all?
Right.
Okay, because I've had reports that it had a wing coming off of the upright on each side, and it had a chimney on each wing.
No, I do not recall any wings on it. It was a little like a woodshed on the back of it. That would be on the east side, and then there was in the later years they built or dug a well that just outside the door, a short distance, and before that they had always carried their water from a spring.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask Owens also to recall what he can about that house.
Well, basically what I recall of the house was that at that time, as far as I could see, the paint was pretty well gone, and it was occupied by various families. Many of them did not reside there for any length of period, and the house was in somewhat disrepair. It was then I guess eventually it was either torn down or burned. I don't.
Oddly cuffed.
Tore it down. Oddly cuffed tore it down, but.
Was it just an old black and weathered place?
Black and weathered place, yes.
Do you remember any wings on it, Owen?
I don't remember any wings. I don't know if I exactly remember the full detail of the house. I don't. I was never in it to my knowledge.
What would have been some of the names of the people you recall that lived there?
There was Bartons were there for a while. Yeah.
Sticks in my mind. I don't know, either that or some of her relatives lived in there.
We can't pick you up, though.
Yeah, pick him up.
You want to start with that?
I don't think Florence lived there. Florence Annis's mother and stepfather lived there.
That's right.
And Cease.
Farm houses around here somewhere's had one. Now, I think the dugout located over on what is now Muir Park that existed there with little logs around it, as I recall, was pointed out to me as at one time a fruit and vegetable cellar for winter storage of potatoes, roots, and so forth.
Okay, now we're going to talk to Bessie Eggleston a little bit about the old mill site that used to be located on the outlet to the lake over in Muir Park. And that's the same brook that runs right by the Retazic house now on the, would be the west side of County F. And I'm just going to have Bessie tell us a little bit about what she remembers about the old mill.
The area where the mill site was and the water rights were owned by my grandfather, Hugh McGuinn, and they were sold to William Rubishaw and Laura Gay, and they put up a house and built a mill wheel. The water from Ennis Lake was dammed up and held back in order to build up enough power for running the mill wheel, but it did not prove to be very successful, and as time went on, William Rubishaw passed away, and the house was standing vacant, and it became in a state of much disrepair, and eventually Audley Cuff tore it down. The mill wheel, of course, was in a state of disrepair also, and eventually it tumbled over and fell at the side of the little creek, and there are still, well, I shouldn't say there are still, but the last time that I was in the along the creek, there were still pieces of the wheel laying there in the mud.
How far from the road would that be, Bessie, or how far from where Retazic's house is?
It was located just before the bend in the creek. Would that be on the Retazic's
land, or would it be over on the refuge land now?
I believe it is on the Retazic's land. I have never just established the correct line there, so...
Do you remember what the mill was called? Did they have a name for it or anything?
No, they didn't have a name for it.
Now, is that about all you recall about the mill, or do you remember anything else?
Well, I remember the house was a large two-story cracker box type house, and it was never painted, and it was black. It was had a basement, and it was a...
Was there ever a keeper, like a mill keeper, that lived there?
No, there was no one after the Rubishaws left it. There was no one lived there. To my knowledge, that it had never been occupied. But it was a harbor for water moccasins and other kinds of snakes.
I should mention that the background noise on the tape today is from an oscillating fan that's here in the living room at the farm. It's well into the 90s here in the heat of the afternoon today, so that's the reason that we refuse to shut that off. Now moving to another topic that Bessie recalls well is a wonderful old lady that lived in Buffalo Township by the name of Jessie Duncan, who lived on the William Duncan farm down the road from the second Muir farm, the Hickory Hill farm. And Bessie knew Jessie pretty well, and we're going to just talk to her about what she remembers about Jessie.
Jessie was an elderly lady when I was very young, so that's a good many years ago. She lived into her 90s. She was never married. She lived with her brother, William Duncan, and she adopted 2 children. One, Frank Waite, and the other, Annie Duncan Waite. And they stayed on the farm and worked the farm for her. She was a very religious person. She was very strict in her beliefs on Christianity, and a very hard worker. As a girl, our in our Sunday school class. We used to go to their home quite often and sing hymns for her, and she enjoyed it immensely. She was a friend to everyone. She was a marvelous person, very intelligent, and very well liked by everyone.
Bessie, I have heard that Jessie Duncan was confined to a wheelchair or had some problems that way. Is that right?
Yes, from the time I knew her, she was confined to a wheelchair.
And her foster daughter, Annie Duncan, as you said, Waite, she married Frank Waite, I understand. Was she also, didn't she have a problem like that as well?
No, she didn't have a problem like that. She was a very able-bodied person. She and Frank Waite were married after Jessie Duncan passed away.
So they weren't, blood related at all. They were two foster kids that Jessie adopted, and then they decided after she died then to marry each other.
Yes, Frank was a Waite boy, and Annie, I believe if I remember correctly, her name was Williams, and they were no relation whatever.
Did Jessie Duncan ever mention John Muir to you, Bessie, and how she recalled him?
No, I don't recall talking to Jessie about John Muir, but Annie Duncan Waite often spoke of her brother and John Muir. They were very good friends.
What sort of things do you remember Annie Duncan telling you about the Muirs?
Well, she never wanted to be disrespectful in any of their doings or their work, but she had mentioned that, and many others mentioned too, that Daniel Muir was a very hard man on both his family and his horses. And William and John used to meet and spend the afternoon on the Sabbath in the area where the UP cemetery is located now. Then when Daniel Muir moved over to the Cairns place, he was, of course, just a short distance from the Duncan homestead. And they used to exchange ideas and views on politics, on church, and everything in general. They enjoyed conversing because they had so many of their ways were alike and their ideas were alike.
Okay, well, that's good. That's good. Now I'm going to have Bessie comment on the little UP church over here. She's a member of the committee that is in charge of that church, and I'll have her tell us what the name of that committee again is. She's got a key to get into the old church that sometime we'll have to get over and see that. And okay.
Could we do that some other time?
Not today. We won't. But
Okay.
We'll just talk about the church now. We're not going to go over it today.
No, but I mean, I was kind of in a hurry.
Oh, you want to go back?
Yes. Well, the church is called the UP Church, a United Presbyterian Church, and we have officers who have we have UP church officers who take care of the business that has to be handled there, and also of the business with the Cemetery Association.
That's good, Bessie. Thank you very much, Bessie.